The Kutasich is Chelek Tazayin, Teruma Gimel, Le'ili Nishmis Rabbi Yosef Ben Yamin, Ben Reb Menashe, Kaltman. The Sikha is going to address the pasuk V'osu L'mikdash V'zachanti B'seichem from this week's parsha, the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash. We're going to see from the Rambam that there's various psukim that teach us the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash, and there's various parameters to the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash, which very, very fascinatingly is going to be explored in this Sikha, which is going to help us understand what seems to be a contradiction between two Rambams, one in Hilchas Beis HaBchira and one in Hilchas Malachim. From Pasuk V'osu L'mikdash V'shachanti B'seichem, learned is the Rambam in Hilchas Beis HaBchira. The Pasuk V'osu L'mikdash, the Rambam learns as follows. And this is in the beginning of Hilchas Beis HaBchira of the Rambam, the halachas where the Rambam teaches us about the building of a Beis HaMikdash. Mitzvahs asay las is bayis lavaya mucham liyesh makrivim b'yah karbonos. It is mitzvahs asay to build a house for Hashem that is prepared to be able to bring karbonos in it. Shenamar v'osu l'mikdash, and the proof is from the pasuk v'osu l'mikdash, which means where do we have the source in the Torah for the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash? From the pasuk in this week's parsha, Parshas Teruma, the Asuli Mikdash. For his Paras Patera, the Rambam continues that it's already explained in the Torah, the Mishkan, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mishkan, the Moshe Rabbeinu made, all the details are discussed in Parshas Teruma, Tetzaveh, etc. V'hoya lefisha, that Beis HaMikdash, that Mishkan, was a temporary one. Shenemar ki levasim ad ota, the Gomer, you have not yet arrived, el hamenucha vel hanachala, the pasuk says, to a place of tranquility, to a place of your inheritance, which, as Rashi tells us over there, is a reference to Mishkan Shiloi and to Yerushalayim. The fact that the pasuk is telling us that you have not yet arrived to the ultimate place tells us that where we are now, meaning to say in the Mishkan, in the Midbar, is something that is temporary. So, but the most important detail for now from this halacha in Rambam is that the source for the building of a Beis HaMikdash is from the pasuk V'osu L'mikdash. Aber in Hilchas Malachim learned as there is the Rambam from another pasuk, but in Hilchas Malachim the Rambam uses a different pasuk. The Rambam in the beginning of Hilchas Malachim says as follows: Shalosh mitzvahs nestavel Yisrael b'shas kitzas loretz. The Yidden were commanded with 3 mitzvahs upon entry into Eretz Yisrael. The first being to appoint a king. The second being to destroy the offspring of Amalek, and the third is to build a Beis HaBchira, to build a Beis HaMikdash. Then the Rambam brings a pasuk, a source for each of these 3 mitzvahs, and then he says, "V'livnei is Beis HaBchira," the source of the mitzvah of building a Beis HaBchira, shenemar l'shichnei siddur shuvas hashama, is from the pasuk that you should make a place for the Eibusher to dwell, and you should come over there. This is in Parshas Re'eh. We're talking about bringing karbonos, that you cannot bring karbonos on any mizbeach, but from when the Beis HaMikdash was built, from that point on, you can only bring the karbonos on the Beis HaMikdash, on the mizbeach of the Beis HaMikdash. And we'll see in a moment that Rashi says l'shichnei siddur is actually a reference to Mishkan Shiloi, but this is what the Rambam uses as a proof that you have a mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash. So the question is you do a dikasha? Why does the Rambam change? Why does the Rambam not use the same pasuk that he used in the beginning of Hilchas Beis HaBchira, the pasuk of V'osu L'mikdash? Why did he change and use the pasuk l'shichnei siddur? The Lecha Mishnah answered of them. The Lecha Mishnah, which is a commentary on the Rambam, discusses this question, and he answers as follows: as the pasuk V'osu L'mikdash red v'gem Mishkan HaMidbar. The pasuk of V'osu L'mikdash is referring to the Mishkan and the Midbar. Und der pasuk l'shichnei siddur meint the Mishkan Shiloi, wie Rashi attached, and the pasuk l'shichnei siddur is a reference to Mishkan Shiloi. And he continues in the Lecha Mishnah that V'haya Amakim, which is also there in Parashas Re'eh, V'haya Amakim Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha L'shakar Shmei Sham. That's a reference to the Beis Elamim, to the ultimate Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. But he says that Rambam doesn't have to bring the pasuk of V'haya Amakim because because we already have. Because just like in Shiloi and in the Midbar, there was a mitzvah to build a mikdash, Vada the Beis HaBchira mitzvah, certainly in the Beis HaBchira there is a mitzvah as well to build in Yerushalayim. Later the Lecha Mishnah explains why he doesn't want to bring V'haya Amakim, because V'haya Amakim is not said in a manner of commandment. But that's a side thing. The fact is, the Lecha Mishnah explains that we don't want to use V'osu L'mikdash because V'osu L'mikdash is talking about Mishkan HaMidbar. It's stubborn, verstandig. But this approach of the Lecha Mishnah is not understood. First of all, the Baal as binyan bayis lavaya rechen der Rambam minachas beis abchira als mitzvah sasei und das mit der mitzvah neges lederes. The mitzvah to build the house for Hashem in the beginning of Hilchas beis abchira is being said as a mitzvah sasei, which means that it's something that is permanent, it's something that is applicable for generations to come. Why would he bring a pasuk that's only about the Mishkan? If according to the Lecha Mishnah, the pasuk v'asuli migdash is referring to the Mishkan Hamidbar, then why would the Rambam use that pasuk for a mitzvah and a hegis l'deiros, a mitzvah that's applicable after the Yidden leave the Midbar, arrive into Eretz Yisrael for generations to come? Which is b'chlal kasha lahavin, and it's and in a more general sense, it's difficult to understand. As in Hilchas Beis Abchira, was Kishmon Keinhein, in the Hilchas of Beis Abchira, which as their name describes, they are halachas about the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. As the Gan said, Teichin is the mitzvahs asay l'deiros from Beis Hamikdash, that it's all about the mitzvahs asay of building a Beis Hamikdash. Zola bringing a pasuk with the tzivah is af Mishkan Hamidbar. Over there, he brings a pasuk for the Mishkan in the Midbar. Und in Hilchas Melachim was Kishman kein Hein, as es redt sich beikir wegen Minui Melach, soll bringen den Pasuk l'shichne sidrishu, but redt wegen Mishkan Shili and Beis Elamim. And then Hilchas Melachim, which is really about the mitzvah of appointing a king, over there he brings a pasuk, which is referring to Mishkan Shili and Beis Elamim, which over there it's not even talking about a Beis Hamikdash. We're not even really talking about the building of Beis Hamikdash. It's really talking about the mitzvah of appointing a king. So not only in the first question, why is he bringing a pasuk of Asuli Migdash from the Binyan HaMishkan, but when you look at it in contrast to the Hilchas Melachim, where he over there, which is not even about Hilchas Beis Abchira, he brings the pasuk about a permanent Beis HaMikdash, it doesn't fit. So that's our question. Our main question is, why does the Rambam Monavshach, if Asuli Mikdash is a mitzvah neheges l'deiros, why does he not use that pasuk in Hilchas Melachim? And if it is about the Mishkan HaMidbar, how could he use it in Hilchas Beis Abchira? L'chayre came up an so l'chayre we could answer. As the Rambam brings in Hilchas Beis Abchira the pasuk Asuli Mikdash, nit als tzivu yaf Mishkan, nor val von ihm lernt ben up the mitzvah klolos from Binyan Beis Hamikdash. We could answer that the reason why the Rambam brings the pasuk v'asuli migdash in Hilchas Beis Abchira is because he doesn't see it as a specific commandment to build a mishkan in the midbar, but he sees it as the general commandment, the overarching mitzvah of building a Beis Hamikdash. V'iming gefintis in Medrashim, as it is found in Medrashim, one of which we're going to mention in 2 paragraphs, the Medrash Tanchuma. Another one is the Seder Olam, which he references in Ara 10. Over there it says that when the Mishkan was completed, Moshe Rabbeinu gave them a bracha, that they should merit the building of the Beis Abchira, Dichsiv v'yasuli Migdash. So in that Medrash he uses v'yasuli Migdash as a reference to the Beis Abchira. Also we're going to see in a moment in the Tanchuma that he learns that v'yasuli Migdash is the source of the mitzvah to build the Beis Abchira. Beis Abchira obviously being a reference to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. So l'cha'ira, we could say that the Rambam holds that V'asuli Migdash is a mitzvah close, a general mitzvah, not just referring to the Mishkan, but also referring to having a Beis Hamikdash at all times. Lefiza is aber tzedek nit verstandig, but that brings us back to our first question. Was by Binyan Beis Abchira in Hilchas Melachim bringt another pasuk? L'shichne sidrishu v'asa shama. Why would the Rambam bring a different pasuk when it comes to mentioning the building of a Beis Hamikdash in Hilchas Melachim? This question is even greater. As his mashma mesigan alashon v'chulu, from the structure of the Rambam's wording in Hilchas Melachim, it seems to imply, as their mocker from the Rambam in Hilchas Melachim is from the Medrash, was bring the pasuk was on the Mikdash of Beis Hamikdash, that the source of the Rambam is from the Medrash, which says talks about the 3 mitzvahs, and the Medrash itself uses the pasuk v'asuli Migdash. Now here's the lashon of the Medrash and Tanchuma. The Yidden were commanded 3 things upon entering into Eretz Yisrael: to appoint upon themselves a king, and to build for them themselves a Beis Abchira, Beis Hamikdash. Ulach Nizarish Al Amalek, and to annihilate the offspring of Amalek. Manis Alei Amalek Dichsiv Simtasim Alech Amalek. The pasuk, you should appoint for yourself a king. Livnis Le Beis Abchira Dichsiv Yasol Mikdash. Lahach Nizarish Al Amalek Dichsiv Hoya Baniach Alei Lekecha V'Gomer Tim Chazech Al Amalek. Zet Mendach. As beim selben Inyan from the drei Tzivuyim, but the same idea, the same concept which the Rambam brings, the three mitzvahs of appointing a king, of destroying Amalek, and building a Beis Hamikdash, is in Medrash. The Medrash learns this very mitzvah from the Vasili Mikdash. Hein Farvas is the Rambam in Hilchas Malachim Mishane von Medrash von the Beis Hamikdash und bringt dem Ziv von another pasuk. Now the Rambam goes and changes. The Rambam is almost quoting the same teaching about the three mitzvahs, and yet the Rambam changes the pasuk of where the Medrash says Vasili Mikdash and brings the pasuk of the Shichnei Sidrishu. So we're still on our same question: why the Rambam uses the pasuk of the Shichnei Sidrishu in Hilchas Malachim, but the question just became greater because the Medrash itself uses the pasuk. The source of the Rambam uses Vasili Mikdash. Siv Gimel is going to go on to another question, which was referenced a little bit when I mentioned the Lecha Mishnah, that the Shichnei Sidrishu is really about Mishkan Shilai. Why not actually mention a pasuk, even if you're not, for whatever reason, you're not mentioning Vasili Mikdash? But why not mention a pasuk that's more explicitly connected to the Beis Hamikdash? Ich darf verstehen. Auf Binyan Beis Hamikdash der Chvaran a pasuk and tzivim mefurish. With regards to the Binyan Beis Hamikdash, there's a very clear commandment. Nit wie Vasili Mikdash as a pasuk said wegen Mishkan, not like Vasili Mikdash, which on the most basic level is referring to the Mishkan in the Midbar. The pasuk is V'Haya Hamakim Asher Yivchar Hashem Lekecha Boy L'Shakin Shmei Sham. There's going to be a place where the Eibush is going to choose to dwell His name upon it. In Gemara und in Sifri, in Gemara and Sifri, use this pasuk to prove the building of the Beis Hamikdash. The Gemara, just for the sake of the context, this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin, where the Gemara there discusses the three mitzvahs that the Yidden were commanded upon entry into Eretz Yisrael: Minui Melech, appointing a king; Achras Azarish Shal Amalek, destroying Amalek, and the Binyan Beis Abchira. Then the Gemara over there discusses the order. What is the order? What has to be done? And it says that the Gemara says, I don't know. First the Gemara brings a raya that Minui Melech is first. Then the Gemara says, I still don't know if Zarish Shal Amalek comes first, or Lahachri Zarish Shal Amalek comes first, to destroy Amalek comes first, or the Beis Hamikdash comes first. And the Gemara says, first it says in the pasuk earlier, Hashem is going to give you peace from all of your enemies, and you will dwell with assuredly. Amalek is referring to Amalek, to getting rid of Amalek and the other enemies. And is referring to building a Beis Hamikdash. And Amalek comes first. I mean, this is the Gemara uses the raya that the destroying of Amalek comes before the building of a Beis Hamikdash. So, but what do we see from this? That the mitzvah is a pasuk that the Gemara uses to prove the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Isavas bringt the Rambam was rechen the mitzvah ledeiris then pasuk in onim silchas Beis Hamikdash. So when the Rambam starts silchas Beis Hamikdash, why does he not bring the pasuk of Haya Hamakim? Why does he bring Vasili Mikdash and not Haya Hamakim? The Kesef Mishnah for this. The Kesef Mishnah tries to answer this question. And he says like this: well, the Rambam learned as the pasuk V'Haya Hamakim is not gizakivar al satziv which should burn a Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam learns that V'Haya Hamakim is not said as a commandment to build a Beis Hamikdash. The Lecha Mishnah says something very similar. It's not a sipur ba'almahu. It's more like a story. It's like telling you what's going to happen. And I'm quoting now that the Kesef Mishnah to Hasam loipakad livnes Beis Hamikdash. He's not commanding them to build a Beis Hamikdash. There's going to be a place where the Eibush is going to choose. That's the Kasipur Dvarim. That's telling you what's going to happen. And the mitzvah is to bring the Karbanis there. But there's no mitzvah here to build a Beis Hamikdash. As men zal brengen Karbanis l'makam Hashem. Und das, was die Gemara V'Sifri bringt jedem Pasuk, das Blaze als Raya, als Achras, als Arish Shalom Alek, the fact that the Gemara uses this Pasuk is only in the context of to prove that the mitzvah of destroying Amalek comes before the mitzvah of the building Beis Hamikdash. But it doesn't clearly command to build the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore the Rambam can't use it in Hilchas Beis Habchira, because the Rambam is looking for a mitzvah that says V'osu li Mikdash, something where it gives you an explicit commandment. Lefisa Aber, but according to this, is Neisev after Nidglatkeit. Mitzad aklala yadua b'Rambam as bringt der Drash absolute beyeser, aber b'shalei nimtzas b'shas. Well, derech zadav zayin b'nin didan und da is leikenu. First of all, there's a famous rule in the Rambam that the Rambam always brings the simplest limud, the pasuk that is the simplest way to understand, even if it may not have been brought in Gemara. Meaning to say, even if it's not something that the Gemara learns, teaches how to learn it. But if you have a pasuk that tells us a certain mitzvah, and it's very clear and simple from the pasuk that that's the mitzvah, the Rambam always chooses that pasuk. And here the Rambam didn't do that, because V'haya Amalkim is the simplest pasuk. And even if you're going to say that it's not in the Gemara is only using it for the Seder in Yanim, but it's not really in the Gemara. Nevertheless, the Rambam doesn't need it to be in the Gemara. The Rambam usually looks for the simplest pasuk, which is V'haya Amalkim, which is very clearly talking about the Beis Hamikdash. So besides the fact that that's a question number one, that the Rambam changes from his normal order, a normal style, where he goes for the simplest limud, there's another question here. Was bringt es nicht euch der Rambam in Hilchas Melachim als Raya as Achras Azarish Shalamolik Kedemes Lebinyan Abayis? Why does the Rambam not use this? Sorry. In the Rambam, in Hilchas Melachim. Now, like this. In Hilchas Melachim in Halacha Aleph, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, the Rambam brings the three mitzvahs that a person is commanded to do, that the Yidden were commanded to do upon entering Eretz Yisrael, and brings three psukim, one for each of these three mitzvahs. In Halacha Beis, the Rambam discusses the order of the three mitzvahs. First comes mitzvahs Minui Melech. I printed out the Rambam over here. First comes the mitzvah of Minui Melech, which he brings the raya from Shmuel, Eisi Shachalach Hashem Lim Shachach Al Melech. Shmuel says to Shaul that I sent me to anoint you as king. At Talech Vikisas Amalek. Now you can go and destroy Amalek. This is a proof that Minui Melech comes before Amalek. And the destroying Amalek comes before the binyan Beis Hamikdash. And this is from Shmuel Beis. It says the king David HaMelech was sitting in his home, his house. And the Eibishter had brought him peace from his enemies all around him. And now the David HaMelech says to Nas Nanavi, here I am sitting in this very fancy house, a house of cedar wood, and the Eibishter doesn't have a home. So we see that it was only after that he says to Nas Nanavi, it's time to build the Beis Hamikdash. So this Raya says the Rambam that Achrasas Amalek comes before Binyan Beis Hamikdash. Now, that's the Rambam. L'chaira, there's a pasuk. Ve'niach lachem mikalevecha misav v'shaftem betach. Ve'oya Amalkim asher yivcha Hashem alakeichem os'akim v'yishmam. The Ve'oya Amalkim is talking specifically about the Beis Hamikdash. Right before that says Ve'niach lachem mikalevecha. Then this is the Gemara learns a raya that Machras Azarish Amalek comes before Binyan Beis Habchira. So why does the Rambam not use these psukim? Even if you're going to tell me that he doesn't want to use this pasuk because it's not explicitly a pkuda, it's not explicitly a commandment to build a Beis Hamikdash, and therefore in Hilchas Beis Habchira he wants to use Vasuli Mikdash, but at least in Hilchas Melachim he could have used this pasuk as a raya that Achras Azaris Molek comes before Binyan Beis Habchira, especially since this is in Chumash and that's in Nach. This is the pasuk Kamat. This is a much earlier pasuk. Okay, so far we're trying to figure out, number one, why he uses the pasuk in Hilchas Melachim of the Shichnei Siddur Shu Vasashama not Vasuli Migdash, especially since the source of the Rambam, which is in the Tanchuma. He uses the pasuk V'asati Mikdash. We also want to understand why he does not use V'hoya Hamakim Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha Boi in Hilchas Beis HaBchira. And if you're going to tell me and that's not really a pekuda, not really a commandment, but it can only be used as a raya that Amalek comes before, Achras Azare Shal Amalek comes before Binya Beis HaBchira, then why does the Rambam not use V'haya Amakim, at least in Hilchas Malachim, as part of the proof that destroying Amalek comes before building Beis HaMikdash, and the Rambam relies on a pasuk from Shmuel Aleph, from Shmuel Beis. See if Dalit is going to ask, and this is a much easier question. It's longer, but it's a smoother question to follow. In Halacha Beis of the Rambam in Hilchas Beis HaBchira, we're going back to Beis HaBchira. The Rambam describes the Batei Mikdashes, if you will, that existed after the Mishkan, before the ultimate Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. First they were in Gilgal, then they were in Shiloh, then in Neve Givoin, and the Rebbe is going to ask the question: what is the relevance of any of these things that are really just part of history and seemingly not part of halachas? Additionally, there is an explanation required in the Rambam going back to Hilchas Beis HaBchira. But Nachtum says, Messiah min halacha aleph, ukvarnisparish patera mishkan shas Moshe Rabbeinu voyel lefi shah, shenemar kedivasam adata, after saying that the mishkan that Moshe made is this explained in the Torah, but it was only a temporary one, is there mamshech in halacha beis. The Rambam continues in halacha beis. As the Eden entered into Eretz Yisrael, and Midu HaMishkan b'Gilgal Arba Tishana, they established the Mishkan in Gilgal for 14 years. Shekavshu v'Shechalku, that they were conquering and dividing the land. Misham Bo'u l'Shiloi, from there they came to Shiloh. Ubanu Sham Bayis Shel Avonim, they built a structure of stone. Uparsu Yeriyos HaMishkan Alav, and then they covered it with the Yeriyos HaMishkan. It did not have a permanent roof, meaning to say the walls were more permanent, they were made out of stone, but the rooftop was like in the Mishkan, it was the Yeriyos, it was the curtains that covered the Mishkan. And it stood there in Shiloh for 369 years. When Eli passed away, the Mishkan Shiloh was destroyed. They came to the city of Noiv, Ubanu Sham Mikdash, and they built over there a Mikdash. And when Shmuel passed away, Charav, that Mikdash was destroyed. Ubou leGivan, they came to Givan, Ubanu Sham Mikdash, and they built there a Mikdash. Umigivan Bou leBeis Elam, and then from Givan they ultimately came to the Beis Elam, to the ultimate Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. The main Noiv Givan Sheva v'Chamishim Shana, and the time of a Noiv that they had a Beis HaMikdash in Noiv and Givan was 57 years. So this is difficult to understand. The Rambam is like a sefer and halachas. The Rambam is a sefer of halachas. Is the main afkimina la halacha diarichas. What halachic relevance does this long-winded elaboration have? As ma'at ufgestellt the Mishkan b'Gilgal and the Nachin Shiloh never given. Das l'chayda narasipah from Divrei Yisrael. It seems to be a history story. What relevance does it have in halacha? Hey, Nemes, as the marker from the Rabbi and V'chulu, from the Rambam is from the Mishnah Masechtas Zvachim. It's true that the source of this is from the Mishnah Masechtas Zvachim. The Mishnah has various things that are not halachas. Saying in the Sefer Hayad from Rambam must be stated on halachas psukkis. But the Rambam, the Sefer Hayad of Rambam, it consists of only of rulings, halachic rulings. Nachmer, Eich in der Mishnah, even the Mishnah doesn't discuss these buildings just to know what happened. No, but it's telling us different halachas that are relevant. As Bo'u Gilgal Hutru Abamis, when they came to Gilgal, Bamos, private mizbeches, private altars became permissible. And in what area could you eat kachikachim and kachim kalim? Then when they came to Shiloh, the bamas became aser. When they came to Neve Givan, the bamas became mutter. All of this is just a preface as Nachtem as Bo'u Yerushalayim Nesru Habamas. That once this all is a preface to the fact that when they came to Yerushalayim, Bamos became Aser, they never became Mutter again. And that is the word Nachala, because it says Menucha is Shiloh, And that's why in Menucha, the Bamis were Aser, in Shiloi, Bamis were Aser, because it says, so in Menucha and in Nachala, Bamis were Aser, so they were Aser in Shiloi, and they were also Aser in Yerushalayim, because that's the Nachala in the Pasuk. And so the Mishnah brings in these stories, about these other mikdashos, because they have halachic relevance. The Rambam does not bring any of this. And their time is moving with pastors, and the reason is simply understood. Because this is all in the past. What happened happened. The fact that the bamis were mutter or aser is something of the past. Unsum din Rambam malach gimel kiven shenivna migdash b'Yerushalayim nesru kol hamakayim eskulan livneis ben bayis lavayu lakrit ben carbon. And in Halacha Gimel, the Rambam tells us that once the Beis Hamikdash was built in Yerushalayim, all the other places became aser to build a Beis Hamikdash or to bring there a carbon, which that is a halacha that's relevant for the future. In the Rambam, where the Rambam is talking about the halachas that are relevant for the future, the fact that the bamis were mutter or aser before Yerushalayim is irrelevant. The Rambam it was being written after the Beis Hamikdash was built, and after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. So the fact that the halachas that the Rambam is writing are halachas that are mitzvahs that are ledoides. The fact that it was mutter or aser in Shiloi or Neve Givain, that's something that was a temporary thing. This raises the question even more. The Rambam even brings the whole order of events. Beis is the misper from the Yaren. The Rambam tells the number of years, 14 years, and then 369 years, and then 57 years. But even at the time, it had no halachic relevance. The number of years. The Rambam brings details that are not mentioned in the Mishnah. So as we've seen in many a sikha, after finishing all of the questions, there's one more question that is the opening to the answer that answers all the other questions. But let's just quickly go through our questions. On Hilchas Beis HaBchira, number one, we had the question, why does the Rambam bring the pasuk V'asuli Mikdash, according to the Lechem Mishnah, if the Masal Mikdash is about the Mishkan? Why does he not bring the pasuk which is the simplest drasha, and it's referring specifically to the Beis Hamikdash? In Halacha Beis, why does the Rambam bring the Seder of Gilgal Shiloi Neve Given? Why does he mention the number of years, especially if they're not mentioned in the Mishnah? In Hilchas Malachim, we had a couple of questions as well. Number one, why does he bring the pasuk V'shichne Sidrishu and not the pasuk V'asuli Mikdash? Especially since in the Tanchuma he uses the pasuk V'asuli Mikdash. In Halacha Beis, why does the Rambam bring the raya from Shmuel Beis V'hik Yashav HaMelech for the fact that Amalek comes before Binya Beis HaBchira and doesn't bring a raya from the pasuk V'haya. So we have one final question that we have to understand, which is going to be in Sif Hey. The Rebbe is going to ask the question, why does the Rambam even bring in the three mitzvahs if it's Hilchas Malachim? It's Hilchas Malachim, it's about mitzvah of Minui Melech, the mitzvah to appoint a king. Why does the Rambam deem it necessary to bring in the three mitzvahs? And he's going to say also in Sefer HaMitzvahs, and when the Rambam brings the mitzvah building a Beis Hamikdash, he also brings that there were three mitzvahs. And the question is, why is it relevant? Why do we need to know that there were three mitzvahs that were given at the time of when the Yidden went into Eretz Yisrael? But when das Verstehen beachtem levarim tam, we'll understand all of this by first introducing the reason, the explanation of the reason. Was Hilchas Malachim wo redt sich wegen der Mitzvah von Minui Melech, bringt der Rambam echt die Mitzvahs von Binya Beis HaBchira und alle Gimel Mitzvahs. In other words, the Rambam already told us the mitzvah of Hilchas Beis HaBchira. The fact that there's a mitzvah to build a Beis HaMikdash, we already know from Hilchas Beis HaBchira. Why, much later in Hilchas Malachim, does he feel it necessary to bring it again as part of the three mitzvahs? The Rambam brings the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash. Tzivanu las is Beis Avodah v'cholu. He commanded us to build a home or Beis HaBchira la Avodah, a different girsa. That he commanded us to make a chosen home a place of serving Hashem. And this is what it says in the pasuk Vasal Mikdash. Again in Hilchos in Sefer HaMitzvahs, he uses the pasuk Vasal Mikdash. He's a Moshe, and then he adds Velashon Sefri Shalish Mitzvahs Nitztavo Yisrael Be'ez Knesas La'aretz. The Yidden were commanded with 3 mitzvahs when they entered into Yisrael. L'manat Lahem Melech V'livnes Lam Beis HaBchira L'achazar Shal Malek, to appoint a king, to build the Beis HaMikdash, and to destroy the offspring of Amalek. Why are these other 3 mitzvahs relevant when he's talking about the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash? The fact that he begins with the words 3 mitzvahs is seemingly superfluous. The Rambam, as the Gemara and the Sifri, the Rambam enumerates these 3 mitzvahs right away. So why does he have to introduce them with a number? The Gemara often uses the question, phrases the question, why is the number important? Now, listen to this paragraph. This is the first. We're on the top of page 301 because it's going to become very important. We can't say that the reason why it says the number 3 is answered in the Rashi in Sanhedrin. That he says, this is why he mentions these 3. That they are dependent one on another. You have to do them in the right order. First, the appointing of a king, and then the destroying of Amalek, and then the building of Beis HaBchira. You can't say that. That would only explain why he mentions the 3. But not the fact that he says Shalosh mitzvahs, not the number. Why he says the number is not yet explained. So we have we have 2 questions. Number 1, why does the Rambam mention Shalosh all 3 mitzvahs? And number 2, why does the Rambam mention the number Shalosh, the number 3? And we in this last paragraph we already alluded to the ultimate beer. The ultimate beer is going to be on the question, why does the Rambam mention the 3 mitzvahs? Because they were dependent one on another. So it doesn't explain why it says Shalosh, but it does explain why the Rambam brings all 3, because they are interdependent. That's what we're going to learn in Seif Vav. The Bir Bozeh. The 3 mitzvahs are in Belashon Rashi Tluya Zubezu. These 3 mitzvahs are dependent one on another. Das heißt, Agama is ein drei unter the mitzvahs. Although they are 3 individual, specific, separate mitzvahs, is aber jeder mitzvah echa prat. Each one is also an element, brings shleimus in the andere 2 and brings completion to the other 2. Shleimus mitzvahs minui melech werd gerecht wenn sie werden euch ausgeführt die mitzvah von hachere zarish al malach ubim Beis HaBchira. The ultimate, the mitzvah of appointing a king is completed once the mitzvah of destroying Amalek and Beis HaBchira is also done. Now the about the andere, similarly by the other 2, shleimus kiyum mitzvahs being the Beis HaBchira, to the point that the complete mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash is verbunden with the kiyum mitzvahs mini melech v'chamas Amalek, is connected with the mitzvah of appointing a king and fighting Amalek. So this is point number 1. The 3 mitzvahs are dependent one on another, and even though they are each in their own mitzvah, in the other 27 star, he brings examples where you see separate mitzvahs, but how they complement one another. One very easy example, which what he brings at the end of the Ha'ara, is Tefillin Shal Yad and Tefillin Shal Reish. They are 2 separate mitzvahs, which is why some people make 2 brachas on them, and which is why if Chas v'Shalom someone cannot put on Tefillin Shal Yad, he can still put on Tefillin Shal Reish and make a bracha on it. But the 2 mitzvahs complement one another. The way we do it is by putting on both, and they complement each other. Similarly, it's 3 separate mitzvahs, but each one is dependent on the other 2 to reach the completion of the fulfillment of that mitzvah. Let it ben weiter from pasuk, and then we in addition to that we learn from the pasuk as the shaykhis von zubezu is that the dependence, the connection, is also with regards to the order in which they are fulfilled. First, you have to appoint a king, then you have to destroy Amalek, and then the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Da is nit dar a seder in zmanei hachiyu v'kiyum mitzvahs mitzad the Eden nitztavu Yisrael mitzad dem gavra. It's not just an order in which they were commanded to do so, that the Yidden were told this is the order in which it's done. Nor das is a prat in minui melech mitzad dem geder von melech darf sein milchemes amalek binyan beis hamikdash binyan beis habchira. It's not just the gavra, the person is instructed to do it in this order. But part of the definition of the mitzvah of appointing a king is that it has to be followed by the destroying of Amalek and the building of Beis HaBchira. And part of the definition of the mitzvah of building Beis HaMikdash fordert sich, as es soll sein, it needs that it should be preceded by the appointing of a king and the war of Amalek. And obviously, when it comes to Mechamas Amalek, it needs first Minui Melech, and after that, the building of the Beis Hamikdash. In the Haaretz, he brings in 28 star, he brings some support to the fact that the whole Geder of Melech, the whole definition of a king, is one that is involved with going to war. As a matter of fact, the name of the set of halachas in Rambam is Hilchas Melachim u Milchama Yisayim. Part of it being a melech is the Milchama. But so he's saying is that to define what is the mitzvah of melech, it includes, or it depends on the for its shleimus, for its completion, the Milchama that comes afterwards and the building of the Beis Hamikdash that comes afterwards. So just to make sure you understand, these three mitzvahs are dependent one on another, and not only and they have to be done in a specific order, not just as a chiyuv gavre to do in a certain order, but in the geder of the mitzvah, in the definition of the mitzvah, it has to be done in a certain way in order to reach its shleimus, to reach its fulfillment in perfection. And now we're going to say like this. In order to prove that this is not just a chiyuv gavra, but it's part of the geder ha-mitzvah, this is why the Rambam chooses the pasuk from Shmuel Beis. The pasuk, Vahi ki yasem melech beis. And the Rebbe brings down the Rambam in Halacha Beis, the psukim, Vahi ki yasem melech beis. Va'avaye niach le misav mikolevav. Vayemer melech al nas nanav yanech yeshu beis harazim. This is why the Rambam brings this pasuk. The raya from pasuk is nit plays after Maseider from Zman HaMitzvahs. This raya is not just to prove in what order the mitzvahs should be done. After Rufal given genug the erste psukim was the Gemara bringt, to just to prove the order that Amalek comes before before Beis HaBchira. For that we could have used the psukim which the Gemara brings, the psukim from Parshas Re'eh, which is what we asked in our question. Nor beikir, the reason why the Rambam brings these other psukim from Shmuel Beis, ados is an inyan the geder in ki mitzvahs melech u'melchemes v'achras Amalek. That the building of the Beis Hamikdash is part of the definition of the mitzvah of king, of appointing a king and destroying Amalek, and therefore he says, "Vayiki Yosef HaMelech b'Beisei, v'Vayiniach leMisaviv, v'Gema v'Yemer HaMelech." That it was said by the Melech, who was in a situation of Iniachle, who already fought against Amalek, already fought against the enemies around him, and therefore now the Melech says, "Let's build a bayis for Hashem." Because he was part of his being HaMelech. That you don't see in those psukim. He says, you don't see any connection to the Minui Melech. But in Shmuel Beis it says Vayemen HaMelech. It's being said by a king. So it emphasizes the fact that part of being a Melech is building the Beis HaMikdash and destroying Amalek. Der Mitzvah verstandig was der Rambam bringt alle Gimel Mitzvahs in Hilchos Melachim. And this explains why the Rambam brings all three mitzvahs. Both in Hilchos Melachim, when he's speaking about Minui Melech, he brings the other two mitzvahs. And in Sefer HaMitzvahs, when he speaks about Binyan Beis HaMikdash, he brings the other two mitzvahs. Because they are dependent and connected, and they complement and complete each other. And therefore, when you mention Minui Melech, you have to also speak about the other mitzvahs as well. Now we're going to go back to Hilchas Beis Abchira. The Fizeh is Eich Mavur, the Hemshech from the Halachas and Anfang Hilchas Beis Abchira. Now we can also understand what is going on in the first and second and third Halachas Hilchas Beis Abchira. First mitzvah say Las is Bais Lavaya Muchan Chulu Kshenemar Vas Mikdash. At first he says the mitzvah to build a house for Hashem and the use of the pasuk Vas Mikdash. And then he explains that the Torah that the Torah already tells us what the Mishkan looked like, but it was only temporary. Das heißt, as mitzvahs binyan bais la'avaya, geht eich auf der Mishkan was Moshe Rabbeinu hat gemacht. So from this we see that the mitzvah of building a bais la'Hashem is also referring to Moshe Rabbeinu's Mishkan. In other words, the mitzvah of building a Bayis LaHashem did not start by the mitzvah to build a Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. The mitzvah, the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu built was also part of the overarching mitzvah of building a Bayis LaHashem. It's just that one was temporary. So obviously there was more to it than just what Moshe built. So there's going to be more to it. But it begins already in the midbar. And since the building of the Beis HaMikdash is connected to the other two mitzvahs, in order to properly fulfill the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash, you have to also have, prior to that, the appointing of a king and the war against Amalek. Darfman Zogin as Azoy is given by alle Batei Mikdash. So therefore, we have to say that all the Batei Mikdash that came even before the ultimate Beis HaMikdash had all three elements: the appointing of a king, the war against the enemies, and the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Das heißt, as Gama does eine Gimel mitzvahs and Nistavo Yisrael b'Shas K'Sas and Loretz, even though these three mitzvahs were commanded when the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, you just know them tzivi from all drei mitzvahs. This is only with regards to the three mitzvahs being commanded at once. That all three mitzvahs have to be done at the same time, or commanded at the same time. Since the mitzvah of building a house for Hashem is one commandment that is relevant to all generations, which is the pasuk V'aseh Mikdash, which includes also the previous buildings, those which were before the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, is move on as eich by jeden friedik in binyan HaMikdash Mishkan idas given nachdem is given HaMelech. It's understood that every single one, every Mikdash first had a king, and there was also the peace from the enemies around, meaning to say there was a war that was won. I'm going to explain this, even though some of this stuff is going to be mentioned again later in the Sikha more clearly, but I'm going to explain this in the following way. Mikdash, even though al pi pashtos, it means the Mishkan. It means the Mishkan Sha'asa Moshe. The Rambam learns that V'asuli Mikdash is a general mitzvah to have a Bayis LaHashem that encompasses everything, every building that was built, or every Mishkan that was built from the Mishkan and the Midbar until the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. There's a mitzvah, general mitzvah, livnes Bayis LaHashem, without going into the specifics of how it's built or where it's built. That is the mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash, and that includes all the Batei Mikdashes, which we're going to see, Shilei, Neve, Given, etc. That's point number one. Point number two is that even though the Yidden were commanded these three mitzvahs when they entered into Eretz Yisrael, but since the Binyan Bayis La'avaya that was in Yerushalayim is the same mitzvah as the Mishkan in the Midbar, therefore the fact that it's dependent on two other mitzvahs also is relevant even before the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael, and even before the Beis HaMikdash was built in Yerushalayim, that there has to be that there are tluya zu bezu, that you need to have all three elements. Nor Kishem v'dishleimus in Beis HaMikdash atzmi l'deidei deidus is given the binyan Beis Halam k'shnivna HaMikdash b'Yerushalayim. It's just we have to separate all the other previous Batei Mikdashes and the one in Yerushalayim, the ultimate one, which was l'deidei deidus. That the one that the completion, the fulfillment of the mitzvah Bayis LaHashem was the one in Yerushalayim. Also, the other details and conditions, which was Mini Melech Mechamas Amalek, as a Shleimus as a Chuf Getan durch the Minyan Meis Hamikdash Yerushalayim Davke, the completion of it was in Yerushalayim, but an element of it existed even before Yerushalayim as well. High time. Bring the Ram and the Pasuk was the Mikdash and the Gleich Mamshech von Spanish Potato Mishkan Shas Moshe Rabbi Nevayil Fisha. This is why the Ram used the Pasuk was the Mikdash and then immediately explains that this was a temporary thing. The Tzivik Kipsut is doch given af Mishkan Shas Moshe. The literal commandment was about the Mishkan. And this also included all the details. Because Moshe was a king. And it was after they were able to rest from the war with Amalek, where Yeshua weakened Amalek and his nation with the sword. So even though the V'asol Mikdash is referring to the, not even though, so the Mishkan, the Alpipashtos, the V'asol Mikdash is referring to the Mishkan Shasa Moshe, but it has to include the other two details of Mini Melech, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, and Milchemes Amalek, which was done by Yeshua. And now, even though it was referring to them, that Mishkan, on fun demot on is the Chiyuv Atziv for V'asol Mikdash, but then the V'asol Mikdash is a Chiyuv that remains forever. So it started out being about the Mishkan, but it remains forever even after the Mishkan ceases to exist. Which answers our question why the Rambam uses Vasili Mikdash, because over here he's talking about the mitzvah of Binyan Bayis LaHashem, and the mitzvah of Binyan Bayis LaHashem is a mitzvah l'doros. It's a mitzvah for all generations, and therefore when he talks about the Hilchas Beis Abchira, he starts with the mitzvah of Vasili Mikdash. Now, and he's going to say in Sivches that this also explains why the Rambam goes into the Arichis about the other Bati Mikdashos that came after the Mishkan, because the Rambam is trying to make the point that the Binyan Bayis LaHashem with the details of Minui Melech and Mechamas Amalek are relevant. Is something that was l'doros. So in order to make that point, he shows us how this inyan of Bayis LaHashem continued even before, after they were in the Midbar, even before the Beis Hamikdash was built. Late time is moving, but the Rambam is Meirich. Unable from Mishkan Shas Moshe Rabbeinu Fayil to show why the Rambam elaborates. First, he says that the Moshe was the Mishkan, the Moshe made was temporary. Then he continues that once they came into Yisrael, they established the Mishkan in Gilgal. As their tzivah from V'asali Mikdash, Mishkan Moshe is going to tzivah l'doros. This is how the Rambam is proving to us that the Mishkan that Moshe made, V'asali Mikdash, was a tzivah l'doros. And they continued to fulfill that Mishkan, that commandment when they established the Mishkan in Gilgal. The Chelek is now given in the Meifan Akiyum. The difference would be in how it was done. The Mikdash also Moshe, Bibalde is given geboit in Midbar, unaufgestellt wie Masa l'Masa. The Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made was taken down and erected every time they camped, and therefore it was built as a Mishkan on oil. It was built as something temporary. Nor lefisha. But mainly is there this temporary status continued when they entered into Eretz Yisrael. Calls man they seinen dort given in Aseder from the Fisha when they were still in a state of temporariness. Aided them Gmar from the Arbes before they finished the 14 years of Kavshu v'Chalku. They were still fighting, they were still conquering, they were still dividing, and therefore they were in a temporary state, and therefore the Mishkan was also Alefisha was the same Mishkan, it was still temporary. And Yeshua was a Melech. I have a little bit of a hard time with the positioning of these words, but the way I understand it is that they had the inyan of Minui Melech at the time because Yeshua was a Melech, as he's going to mention later. The Rambam says that Yeshua was appointed as a king, so they had the inyan of Minui Melech, and they had the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, and it could be they had the inyan of Milchama because they were being Kaivish, even though they didn't have Menucha yet, but I'm not sure about that. But the Rambam is telling us that when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they continued the Bayis LaHashem, even though it was Lefisha, they continued the Bayis LaHashem in Gilgal for 14 years. Umisham bo l'Shilai, then they went to Shilai, where the third side, and they didn't give any matzah from Menucha Yesir in Eretz Yisrael. They had more peace, more tranquility. So Shachalka was after they finished to conquer and divide Eretz Yisrael. Then they built already a house of stone. Nitken oil, not vibis damos, not a temporary structure as it was until that point. Nor shin samach teshan mishkin shilek. It was there for 369 years. And the way I understand this is that the fact that the Rama mentions the number is to show the sense of permanence that it had. That it wasn't just 14 years, it wasn't just mimasa lamasa, from one trip to the next trip, but it was 369 years. Keep in mind that the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was 410 or 420. So 369 is not much behind that. It was a long period of time. The Ram then continues that afterwards they went to Noiv and then they went to Givain, which was for 57 years. The says as the Ram also uses the word that they built a Mikdash. Although they didn't have the Oren in Noiv or Givain. And in certain places it's called a large bama, as if to imply that it wasn't really a Beis HaMikdash. But the Rambam doesn't use that term. The Rambam uses the Bana Sham Mikdash. Well, the mitzvah is binyan HaMikdash is echt given, because the Rambam is telling us that the mitzvah of building a Mikdash was being fulfilled even then. Since they hadn't totally reached peace and tranquility from war, the river is made given nid beis elamim. Therefore, it's not called a beis elamim, an eternal home. And only given both beis elamim, but from given they go to beis elamim. Because demot is going to from melech b'shleimus by David u'shleima. Then they had a real concept of king, because he had David HaMelech and Shleima HaMelech. And also the ultimate completion, ultimate peace from the war with Amalek, because Amalek was destroyed or almost entirely destroyed. The Rebbe in the Aris refers to the fact that Amalek was never ultimately destroyed, because you all the way down until the time of Purim, you had descendants of Amalek. But overall, there was menucha from Amalek at that time. So the ultimate completion of this mitzvah happened in the Beis HaMikdash, where you have a building, where you have a Beis Elamim, a permanent Beis HaMikdash. You have a permanent king, and you have a permanent peace from Amalek. But that was the end of the fulfillment of this mitzvah. But in order for us to understand that the binyan bayis lavaya, the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash, which is the mitzvah learned from the Asuli Mikdash, is something that exists at all times. Therefore, the Rambam had to bring these other Bati Mikdashes, Gilgal, Shiloi, Noiv Givain, and then Beis Elamim, to make this point that the binyan bayis lavai is a mitzvah which is at all times. Now we can understand why the Rambam uses the pasuk l'shichnei sidrishu in Hilchos Malachim. Now we understand why the Rambam brings all three mitzvahs in the beginning of Hilchos Malachim. And why he brings the pasuk l'shichnei sidrishu nitem pasuk v'aseh l'mikdash uneich nit kein pasuk mefurish b'negei Beis Elamim. Nor does he bring a clear pasuk about the Beis Elamim, about the Beis Abchira, which was the pasuk of Haya Amakim Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokeichem l'shakin boy l'shakin shmei sham. Yes, since it's talking about the time when they're entering into Israel, look after they conquered and divided the land. They already then had the obligation and the fulfillment of the three mitzvahs. Even though, like we said before, the ultimate completion of it was in Yerushalayim, but when they already began to fulfill it, as soon as they entered into Israel, they already had a structured building, nitkin oil vilifnez, not a temporary structure as was earlier on, noch the Yudalit Shana from Kibbutz V'chiluk, and it's after the 14 years of Kibbutz V'chiluk. It's given a matzah from Menucha Net Yisrael. There was a state of peace in Israel. And it was Yeshua. Through Yeshua was appointed as king. And it was done through Moshe and Moshe's Bezdin. The mitzvah from the Melech Tazayin L'Deiros, as the mitzvah is as it's supposed to be. Through a Bezdin of 70 Skenim and a Navi. So when is the first real fulfillment of the mitzvah of all three mitzvahs at once? At the time of the Yidden going to Eretz Yisrael. Where were they at that time? After the 14 years of Gilgal, of Kibbutz V'chal Chiluk. It is in Shiloi, and therefore the Rambam brings the pasuk L'Shich Nesid Rishuv Hashem, which is talking about Shiloi. Because in Shiloi is where you have all three mitzvahs come together. You have the Menucha. Let's go in the order. You have Minui Melech. Yeshua as the Melech who was appointed via Darv Tzayin in the proper way through Moshe and his Bezdin. You have a Navi and you have the Shivim Skenim. There was Achras Azare Shalom Alek, which was referring to the peace from the enemies. They had the Menucha because they were Kovish Eretz Yisrael from the other nations, and now they have Mishkan Shiloi, which is a base, which is a more permanent bayis la Hashem. And therefore, he uses the pasuk of Shich Nesid Rishu, which is talking about Mishkan Shiloi, which is when these three mitzvahs were fulfilled. The Mishkan was given in the Midbar Lamasa. The Mishkan in the Midbar was in a Midbar. It was temporary. Not in a matzah of Menucha, nor was it in a matzah of Menucha. They were running away from. They wanted to go from Mitzrayim. They hadn't yet taken over Eretz Yisrael. They weren't settled. Even though we mentioned that Moshe Rabbeinu was a melech, and the Rambam says it, nevertheless, we don't find that it was done in the proper order of a minui by the Bezdin. He was appointed by the Eibishter to become the melech, but not in the way it's done in the mitzvah. So it doesn't have the full. All the details of mitzvahs minui melech, and therefore Shiloi is the first time that we experience these three mitzvahs being done properly together in the order of minui melech, melchama from the enemies, and binyan of a bayis la Hashem, and therefore the Rambam brings the Shich Nesid Rishu, which is a reference to Mishkan Shiloi, which is where these mitzvahs are fulfilled. So this is incredible how it all comes together. If we want to go back to our questions, why does the Rambam bring the pasuk Vasili Migdash? Because first of all, Alpi Pashtos is talking about Mishkan of Moshe, and because Vasili Migdash is actually teaching us that the mitzvah of binyan bayis la Hashem for all times. Why doesn't he bring the pasuk V'Haya Makom Shivcha Hashem? Is for the same reason, because he wants Vasili Migdash. He wants to speak about all the Bati Migdashes, not just the binyan Beis Abchira, but he wants to speak about all of them, from the Mishkan Shasa Moshe to Noiv to Shiloi, Noiv given, etc. Why does he bring the Seder of Gilgal and Shiloi and Noiv, and he brings the years? Because he wants to bring out the fact that this mitzvah was being fulfilled at all times, including in Gilgal, including in Noiv Givain, and he brings the years, and this I'm not 100% sure about, but this is the way I understand it, to point out that in these places, Shiloi and Noiv Givain, there was a sense of permanence. It was not like the Beis Hamikdash in the Yerushalayim, but still it was a Bayis Shalavanim. It was a Bniyah. There was a sense of permanence. Now, if we go to Ilchas Malachim, why does he bring the pasuk L'Shich Nesid Rishu Uvasa Shama? The answer to that question is because he wants to talk about Mishkan. He wants to refer to Mishkan Shiloi, which was the Mishkan that they built when they entered into Eretz Yisrael, and they fulfilled these three mitzvahs properly: Minui Melech through Yeshua, Milchama from the enemies through Kibbutz V'chiluk, and the Bayis la Hashem through Mishkan Shiloi. Why does the Rambam bring the Raya in Halacha Beis from Shmuel Beis and not from the pasuk V'Haya Makom? Because he wants to bring out that the building of the Beis Hamikdash is a chelik of the mitzvah, is a prat in the Gedera mitzvah of Minui Melech, and therefore he brings the pasuk Vayiki Yashav HaMelech to say that it was part of the fact of him being a Melech. Why does he bring the three mitzvahs when he talks about Minui Melech? That was the last question. That was really the first question, is because all three mitzvahs are dependent one on another. I'm still not sure the answer to the question of the binyan alamali, why he has to bring the number shalish, and I don't know if it gets answered unless it's in the ha'aris, and I didn't learn all the ha'aris yet. But we'll have to figure that out. Sif Yud is going to bring in a new inyan, relatively speaking. But now that we understand that all of the Bati Mikdashes that came even before the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim are all part of this mitzvah of Binyan Bayis LaHashem, it'll actually have a halachic relevance, which is the machlekes of the Rambam and the Smag, and we're going to see what the Rambam shita is. We can also answer a question with regards to halacha b'poil. The Rambam paskin for also l'adam sheyasa bayis tavnis ha'echel. It's also for a person to make a house that is in the same shape as the hechel. Chsadre tavnis ulam. You're not allowed to make a receiving room or a hall in the same shape as the ulam, or a porch in the same shape as the ulam. Chatzer keneged ha'azara. You're not allowed to make a chatzer, a yard, a space that is exactly like the azara. That's the Rambam Paskins. Since all the above mentioned buildings, that which was built in Chelek, that which was built in Neva Given, all have the din of Mikdash. And by each of them, they fulfilled the mitzvah of Ha'asuli Mikdash. Biz, so much so as Eichter Beis HaMikdash, Hagama sein Zier und die Pratim von Midas Arki Verachbei seinen Gewinn anders wie in Mishkan. So much so that the Beis HaMikdash, even though its shape, its size, the length and the breadth of it was different, the measurements were different in the Mishkan. Von deswegen seinen den Yonim Ikrim Shebeig Medugas HaMishkan. Nevertheless, some of the primary elements of the Beis HaMikdash were mimicking the Mishkan. The Rambam writes, as an example, that out further away from the Heichel, there was another mechitza, another partition, similar to the curtains of the Chatzer. In the Mishkan of the Midbar, there was the Mishkan that was surrounded by the Krashim. Then there was a Chatzer area, and the Chatzer area in which was the Mishkan and the Mizbeach and the Kier, and around that there was a much bigger space that was closed in by the Kloim, by the Kalei HaChatzer. Similarly, in the Beis HaMikdash, there was around the Beis HaMikdash, there was another space surrounded with another mechitza. And everything that was within this area in the Mishkan was called Chatzar Oyel Moed. In the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was called Azara. So from this we see that even though the sizes were different, but nevertheless the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim was copying many of the elements of the Mishkan in the Midbar. Is Yeshleimar, based on this, we could say as the Isser Lasis Bayis Tavnis V'chulu, the Isser to make a house the same shape as the Beis HaMikdash is Chol Eichaf Nachmach and the Tavnis for Mishkan Shili and Neve Given. It would also apply that you're not allowed to copy the Mishkan, you're not allowed to copy Mishkan Shili, and you're not allowed to copy Neve Given. Because now that we have established that all those were part of the mitzvah of Asali Mikdash, part of the mitzvah of Lasis Bayis LaHashem, then they are included in the Isser of copying them when making your own house. You can see there's a lot of ha'aris over here. For example, the Minchas Chinuch says, how do we even know the sizes of Mishkan Shiloi and Neve Given? The Rebbe answers that from the fact that we weren't told the measurements, it must mean that the measurements were exactly the same as the Mishkan. And it's a lot of beautiful depth in there, but we're going to leave it at that. We're going to go to the Sif Yud Aleph and the Biur in these three mitzvahs, B'Pnimis Ha'inyanim. The Biur B'Pnimis Ha'inyanim. In the Teichen and Seder from the Gimel mitzvahs in Chassidus, we look at the message, the theme of these three mitzvahs according to Chassidus, and also their order. Chassidus explains, as same Tas Malach Melech as a B'china von Yira. The mitzvah of Minui Melech, the mitzvah of appointing a king, is the mitzvah of the level of Yira. But a Melech is Yoni Yarei Hashem Yisbarach B'Yeser says, the idea of a Melech is that he fears Hashem more than anyone else. And his Batel Tzumei, he is in a state of bittul, of humility and dedication to Hashem. Und durch der Melech wird nimmt die Yira und bittul zum ganzen Namen. And through the Melech, he passes on, he draws down this Yira to the rest of the people. So the idea of appointing a king is the mitzvah of Yira. Once we reach the level of Yira, the Dinyan von Iskafia, which is the idea of subduing the evil, the bad. Then comes the next mitzvah of destroying Amalek, the Dinyan von Ubi'ar of entirely removing the bad. The next level is this hapcha, when you transform the bad, that it's not just being subdued, but it ceases to exist, it becomes good. And once you went through his kafya and through his hapcha, then you could come to the level of Yira, the higher level of Yira. But this comes through the mitzvah of Beis Hamikdash. The mitzvah of building a mikdash is the mitzvah of Yira, which is umikdashi tiro. So we see the idea of Yira by the mikdash. But die madrege von Yira come from Chines Chachma in Yira, which this level of Yira can be reached through Chachma. The Eibus is Chachma. The main Chachma in Yira, which is the idea of Torah, through learning Torah, you can reach the level of Yira, of Yira. And in every generation, even after the Beis Mikdash was destroyed, the Daled Alma Shel Halacha, through learning Halacha, you can reach the Chachmas HaTorah, which brings you to Yira Ilah, which in the order comes after Iskafia and Ishapcha. Noch Pise, wenn wir verstehen, für was der Zivi verbinden mit dem Mikdash und echt verbinden von ersten Mikdash Mishkan Bepeil, hat gedarf sein Davke durch Moshe Rabbeinu. And now we're going to connect the first Mishkan and the last Mishkan, the first Mishkan and the final Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, and ultimately the ultimate Beis Hamikdash Shlishi. We're going to connect all of them. That the first one has to be done through Moshe Rabbeinu. When the Rambam is medayik for Nesparas B'Tei Mishkan Shal Samishpan, the Rambam emphasizes that it was done by Moshe Rabbeinu. Warum die Amshachas Adas zu Yeder Eden was durch dem kommen zu Yid, not Moshe. Because how do you bring down Das to every Yid, which Das leads to Yira? As we know that in order to go from Moichin to Midas, you have to have the Hiskashrus of Das. So the Yira, which is a Midah, needs Das. How does the Yid have the Das to be able to do Yira? Is through Moshe Rabbeinu. That the Eibishter says to Moshe Rabbeinu, to the Yidden, what is the Eibishter? Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Yidden, what does the Eibishter expect from you? It's just to have Yira. So the Gemara asks, is Yira such a small thing? And the Gemara answers that yes, with regards to Moshe, Yira is a small thing, a doable thing. And as we know, he'll mention it in the next paragraph. But we know from the Maimavat at Tetzava and from other places that there's a Moshe from Tanya, that there's a Moshe b'kol echad ve'echad who gives us the ability to reach Yira. When the Ribra Tatzchalas inyan Melucha Yira Tatav is the minyan Mishkan Yira Ilah lachrei zeh gedav kumen al Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore the beginning of Melucha, we said Moshe Rabbeinu was a Melech, and which is Melucha is Yira Tatav, and the binyan Mishkan, which is Yira Ilah, it all had to start with Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu gives us the power to have Yira, and it gives us the das to be able to reach Yira Ilah. Nochmer, the Inyan Mishkan v'Mikdash is Dachmaim and Azal b'Seichel and Emer al b'Seicham b'Seichel Lecha Vecha Yisrael. The whole idea of the Mishkan is something that is something within every single Yid. As jeder Yid can und darf uftan zu sein allein am Mishkan und Mikdash b'Seichanti b'Seicham, that every Yid has to work on himself to be a Mishkan und Mikdash b'Seichanti b'Seicham, and then Eibishter could dwell within every Yid. Und dem Keach of them hat from Beginnes Moshe. Was is done by him, and the Keach comes from the Moshe that's within every Yid. When the Rambam is a Masbir, as the Gabi Kolechad V'Echad Yisrael is a Yira Milsa Zutrasi via State and Pasuk Sheil Me'imach, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that every single Yid Milsa Zutrasi Yira is something that's easily accomplished because of the Moshe that exists in every single Yid. So that was the starting point. The starting point was Moshe Rabbeinu, who started out because he's the one who gives the Koyach to be able to reach the Yira. On the other hand, is Shleimus to Mitzvah Binyan Mikdash. The ultimate mitzvah was fulfilled in Yerushalayim. Because the true and complete version of kingship was done through David HaMelech. And then there's the ultimate revelation of Malchus, which is referring to Mashiach, who's going to be a Melech, who's going to arise from the house of David, who's going to learn Torah and involve himself in mitzvah David Aviv, and he's going to bring all the Yidden to follow in ways of the Torah and to strengthen its cracks. And he's going to go to war. So you have Yamid Melech, you have the fact that he's a king. Yilchem Milchemes Hashem is going to fight the wars of Hashem to be able to make it possible to do the mitzvahs. Ubana Mikdasim Kem is going to build a Beis Hamikdash. So the ultimate, it started with Moshe Rabbeinu, who had all three. And ultimately, it's going to end with Mashiach, who also has all three. Because then we'll be from the Melech B'Shleimus. Then we will have the ultimate concept of king. And then Amalek will be destroyed b'shleimus. As v'zayin Hashem shalom v'akisei shalom. And it says kiyad al kes yah v'chama Hashem ba'amalek. So it says in Akisei and Hashem shalom and Akisei shalom. Hashem's name is incomplete. Hashem's throne is incomplete. Until Amalek is totally destroyed. That's going to happen when Mashiach comes. That Amalek will be totally destroyed, and the Eibishter's kingship and the Eibishter's throne will be complete. Then there'll be the revelation of the Eibishter's kingship. When Shleimus and Minyam you can have the completion of Melech, and the completion of the destruction of Amalek, and the completion of the Beis Hamikdash, which is going to be a binyan nitzchi, an everlasting building, a building that was built by the Eibishter, speedily in our days, to the ultimate completion of all these three mitzvahs will be when Mashiach comes. But it started with Moshe Rabbeinu. It was more fulfilled in Shiloh. It was more fulfilled in Yerushalayim, and its ultimate completion will be in the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, b'mheirav yameinu b'karav mamish.